They say his chambers had no windows, just velvet curtains, candlelight, and cries no one dared question. The maids weren't allowed to speak after sunset, and if they heard footsteps behind them, they were told to keep walking. Spain had seen cruel kings before, but Ferdinand VII? He didn't rule with law, he ruled with fear and desire. Inside the palace, there were rooms that didn't exist on the map, hallways that curved without reason, doors that led nowhere unless you had the key. And somewhere behind those doors, he built a world entirely his own. A world where pleasure was pain and loyalty was rewarded with silence. Visitors said the palace smelled like perfume and iron, that the candles never fully lit the room, and that the walls, yes, the walls were padded. They called it madness. Some called it sin. But those who truly knew Ferdinand called it something else. A performance, one only he could direct, and no one could escape. So ask yourself, what would drive a king to turn love into punishment? And what happened to the women who disappeared inside his golden cage? Because history forgot their names, but their shadows still linger in the halls. Before the shadows of his palace deepened, before the chambers were locked from the outside, there was only a boy born into gold, yet raised in silence. Ferdinand was not loved, he was managed. Spain in the late 1700s was a land trembling under its own weight. War loomed constantly, the crown was heavy, and the child who would wear it was taught to fear more than to rule. From the moment he could walk, Ferdinand's life followed only two sounds, the church bell and his father's voice. He was baptized not just in holy water, but in expectations thick as iron chains. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, rarely held him. Affection, she believed, softened the will of kings. Instead, she let the tutors raise him, men with powdered wigs and cold eyes who whispered in Latin and struck with canes. One of them once told him, "Only weak princes cry. Strong kings make others cry for them." So Ferdinand stopped crying. He learned to bow properly before he could speak clearly. He wore silk that itched his skin and shoes that blistered his feet. But he never complained, not because he was strong, but because no one would listen if he did. The palace was a place of rules. No running, no loud voices, no asking why. At night, he would lie still beneath ceiling frescoes of saints and swords, staring upward, wondering if heaven was this silent too. The windows in his bedroom were always closed, the curtains drawn, even in summer. "It keeps the evil spirits out," a maid had whispered once, but Ferdinand suspected it was something else they were trying to keep in. As he grew, he learned to imitate the saints he saw in paintings, eyes lifted to heaven, hands folded, mouths shut. He watched his parents parade through ballrooms masked in powdered joy, while behind closed doors they screamed at each other over alliances, lovers, and betrayal. He watched soldiers kneel before his father and beggars get kicked away from the palace gates, and he wondered what kind of God allowed both to happen in the same place. He wasn't allowed to play with common children. Too dirty, they said. Too dangerous. Instead, he was given mechanical toys, little wind-up soldiers with swords that never bent, and miniature palaces where no door opened. At 9, he was made to sit through hours of church confession, not to speak, but to listen. He heard men confess sins he didn't yet understand, desires, thoughts, nightmares, things they said would damn them forever. Ferdinand memorized those words. He didn't know what lust meant, but he knew it must be powerful, because grown men wept when they said it. And deep inside him, something began to change. Something curious, something afraid. By 12, he was already being watched by ministers. They judged the firmness of his walk, the tone of his voice, the way he looked at women. And if he looked too long, they corrected him with books, scripture, discipline. He read about saints who starved themselves to escape temptation. He read about martyrs burned alive with smiles on their faces. He read about kings who conquered cities but lost their souls to love. And in that maze of words he drew his first conclusions. Desire was dangerous. Love was a weakness. And women? Women were gates to ruin. So he turned inward. He began to write letters he never sent, pages filled with questions. Why does the candlelight feel warmer than people? Why do I feel seen only when I am alone? He burned the pages himself, one by one. Not out of shame, but out of fear someone might answer. At 13, he caught a maid staring at him too long. She smiled. He told a guard she had stolen something. She was dismissed the next day. No one asked what had been stolen. No one noticed it was his first attempt at control. By 15, Ferdinand had learned how to mask his face better than any court performer. He smiled at balls, bowed before bishops, laughed at plays. But inside, he was always listening, to footsteps behind doors, to breaths behind curtains, to the slow drip of candle wax on marble. He had learned not just to obey power, but to mimic it, and the more he mimicked, the more they praised him. Such poise, such maturity, already fit for the crown. They didn't see the tension in his jaw, the bite marks on his thumb, the dreams he never spoke of. In those dreams, he wasn't the king, he was the curtain, silent, watching, trapping light inside. As Spain stumbled through revolutions and court conspiracies, Ferdinand stayed silent. He watched allies betray each other. He watched priests bless executions. He watched men kneel and kiss rings with lips they used to curse. And he took notes. They said he was patient, but he was only waiting for the moment when the crown would be his, and the palace would finally belong to him. Not just the throne room, but the chambers behind the mirrors, the doors with no keys, the places no one dared walk after dark. Because while Spain thought they were raising a king, they were breeding something far more dangerous. A man who mistook silence for safety, obedience for love, pain for proof of loyalty. And by the time he reached manhood, his smile no longer needed mirrors. He was no longer a boy, not in the eyes of the palace nor in his own. He had become a shadow that moved when summoned, a whisper that lingered in marble halls. They said his rule would bring strength, but strength to Ferdinand was never about war or diplomacy. It was about silence, obedience, control. He started with the walls. Rooms were redesigned without architects. Corridors extended into places that never existed before. When asked, he'd say, "The palace breathes. I simply give it lungs." And inside these new lungs, he built his kingdom. A secret kingdom, carved behind mirrors, beneath the floorboards. A world that the court pretended not to see. There were chambers with velvet floors where time forgot how to move. Chambers without windows, without clocks, where only candlelight kept secrets alive. It began with whispers. A nobleman's daughter who came to sing at court and never left. A seamstress summoned to adjust the queen's gown and never returned home. They were not stolen, they were chosen. He called them muses. He said they inspired him. He made them perform roles, not for an audience, but for him alone. Some were dressed as queens from centuries past. Others were told to pretend they were saints in agony. And always, always, they had to smile. One woman, barely 17, was brought in after a royal ball. She had danced only once with the king, just once. The next morning, her family was told she had taken ill and would rest in the palace infirmary. She was never seen again. Behind the gold-leaf doors, she was renamed. Ferdinand refused to use their real names. Names are for people with choices, he once muttered. Servants were forbidden to speak to the girls. Anyone caught making eye contact was reassigned. Anyone caught listening disappeared. One footman, young, clumsy, curious, dropped a tray outside one of the chambers. He apologized, cleaned it, and thought nothing more. That night, his quarters were found empty. His belongings burned. Ferdinand believed punishment wasn't just for disobedience, it was for attention. The chambers had rules. Each girl was assigned a script. Some were mothers, some were brides, some were nuns. They were told how to walk, how to speak, when to cry. If they cried outside the script, they were punished. A diary was once discovered, hidden behind a loose floorboard. Half of it was torn, the rest burned along the edges. In it, the writer said, "I forgot which version of myself I'm supposed to be today." Another entry read, "Sometimes I dream I'm the candle, just the candle." He'd make her wear a wedding dress every week, force her to recite vows to him over and over, then lock her in her chamber for days. Servants said they heard music sometimes, followed by screaming. But the palace was trained to hear nothing, to feel nothing. In one case, a maid claimed she saw the reina figure standing behind a curtain, pale, trembling, whispering something that sounded like, "Get me out." The maid never returned to her post. The women were not allowed to write, they were not allowed to age. If they grew ill, they were removed. Some were never seen again. Others returned for a brief moment, changed, silent, hollow-eyed. Like ghosts allowed one last walk before vanishing. It wasn't just women. The men around him began to shift too. Guards grew colder. Advisors avoided eye contact. And his wives, his queens, they were not queens at all. The first, Maria Antonia, had grown close to the people. She smiled too brightly, laughed too freely. Within months of marriage, she fell ill. Some said it was tuberculosis, others whispered poison. When she died, Ferdinand did not grieve. He ordered her portrait moved to the cellar. He married again. But the second wife, she never appeared in public. Not once. Her name was Maria Isabel. Some claim she was with child. Others said she had gone mad. But those closest to the palace swore that her screams echoed down the hall at night, and that once, during a thunderstorm, someone saw her banging on a window before the curtains were drawn. She died shortly after. The cause? Complications, the record said. No funeral was held. Ferdinand remarried, and again. 4 queens in total, all young, all isolated. He never let them live as women, only as reflections, each one molded into the roles he chose: virgin, mother, martyr, ghost. He began to grow paranoid. He ordered mirrors covered, then uncovered, then smashed. He accused birds outside his window of spying. He believed the fireplace whispered secrets about him to the walls. A concubine once laughed too loudly. She was removed that night. No one dared ask where she went. Another girl left a pearl necklace in the hallway by mistake. He stepped on it. The next morning, every necklace in the palace was confiscated. He said, "Beauty should not try to trip a king." His power was no longer about ruling Spain. Spain became a backdrop. His real kingdom was built of locked doors, changing names, and rituals only he understood. In one room, he created a stage, red velvet curtains, gilded chairs, spotlight from candle chandeliers. He'd sit in the dark and watch them perform, silent, unmoving, eyes glassy. Sometimes he clapped. Sometimes he wept. Other times he simply left without saying a word. No one knew what he wanted, which perhaps was exactly the point. To be the only one who knew the rules, to decide the script, to punish the improvisers. Because to Ferdinand, love was something to be controlled, desire was something to be reshaped, and punishment? Punishment was just the price of breaking character.
It began with a letter,
Folded neatly, tucked beneath the tea tray, found by a maid who was never meant to read it. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were sharp enough to bleed. I do not remember the name I was born with, only the names he gives me and the ones he erases. The maid didn't know what to do. She had heard whispers. Everyone had. But this was something else. She showed it to a guard she trusted, one who had lost his sister the year before, a girl who had once danced at the palace and vanished without a goodbye. The guard took the letter. Then he disappeared. For 3 days the king said nothing, but the palace changed. The air thickened. Doors were slammed harder. Chambers were locked earlier. Footsteps became quieter, too quiet. And then the first body was found. A servant, the one who'd cleaned Ferdinand's writing room, was discovered face down in the palace garden. The physician called it a seizure, but there was blood in his wineglass and a red ribbon tied tightly around his wrist. Ferdinand said nothing. He simply stared at the body, then whispered, "Let the roots drink him." From that moment, the king unraveled. He began to see things, reflections that didn't match his movements, chairs that creaked without weight, a woman's voice humming behind walls that had no doors. He ordered every mirror in the chamber covered. Then, days later, he tore the sheets off again, claiming the darkness was hiding things from him. He would walk barefoot through the palace at night, dragging his hand along the velvet walls, muttering names no one recognized. Teresa, was she real? Did I make her? Did she make me? Once, he walked into the throne room at dawn, naked from the waist up, his chest scratched, his eyes wide and glowing like lanterns. He shouted at the empty walls, said they were whispering, said the mirror had blinked. He accused the palace cat of spying, then had it killed, buried under the fountain. The guards grew afraid. But fear was not new. They were used to it. What they weren't used to was his fear. Ferdinand, the king who silenced others, had become terrified of silence itself. The only voice he trusted now was his own, and even that began to lie. One night, he locked himself inside his chambers for 2 days. When he emerged, he wore black gloves, even at meals. He claimed his hands had been cursed by touch, that everything he touched now betrayed him. He no longer visited the women, but they still dressed for him, still waited. He installed a hidden window above the chamber hall, so he could watch without being seen. One of the women, Raina or whatever name she'd been given, looked up one day, right at the glass. She didn't scream, she didn't bow, she simply smiled. That night, her room was sealed shut. No one entered again. The next morning, her bed was empty. The king told his advisors, "She flew, swallowed her name and grew wings." His physicians suggested rest, retreat, prayer. He had them all dismissed, then called for a priest. The priest who arrived was young, brave. He had heard stories and wanted to see if they were true. He lasted less than an hour. He left pale, shaking, muttering prayers backwards. He told no one what he saw, only said, "This is no palace. This is a stage built for torment." And still, the palace played its roles. The candle still burned, the guards still bowed, the women still waited, until finally someone spoke. Not a servant, not a guard, a queen, his fourth wife, austere, quiet. She had played the part well, too well. But one night, she broke her silence. At a public dinner, surrounded by nobles and ministers, she stood and said, "He rules ghosts, not people." The room froze. Ferdinand didn't blink. He simply turned to her and said, "Then you will become one." She was escorted out, vanished the next morning. Her portrait was burned in the courtyard, her name erased from every document, as if she had never drawn breath. But it was too late. The ministers had heard, the servants had seen, and the palace began to rot. Not with fire, but with silence, refusing to obey. The halls no longer echoed when he walked. The guards no longer looked afraid, just tired. And Ferdinand, the man who had turned love into punishment, was left, surrounded by rooms that no longer listened. He began speaking to the throne, apologizing, weeping, whispering names like prayers. The candlelight that once lit his secret world now flickered against nothing. Only shadows remained, and even they stopped dancing, because the king had built a kingdom of echoes, and now even the echoes refused to answer. When Ferdinand died, the palace did not mourn. The bells rang, yes, because they had to. The flags were lowered, masses were said, but the halls, they exhaled. The velvet curtains were drawn back, the secret chambers were sealed, and no one, not a single soul, spoke of what lay behind those doors. Records were destroyed, letters burned, portraits taken down and replaced with saints. The girls, they were never named, never buried. They vanished not just from the palace, but from history itself. Some claimed they'd been sent to convents, others said they walked into the river. But the older maids, the ones who had learned to hear what was forbidden, they whispered a different truth. "The rooms are still warm," they'd say, as if someone just left, as if someone's still watching. The new king ordered a full restoration, new paint, new windows, new rules, but something lingered. A ring was found, a delicate silver band with a missing stone, buried in the ashes of a sealed fireplace. A torn ribbon floated down from the rafters during a state dinner. No one knew where it came from, but one of the nobles turned pale and excused himself. A faded portrait was discovered in the attic years later. A woman in white, no name on the canvas, just the date, 1819, and a single word scratched into the back frame, "Mine." Ferdinand had a daughter. She became queen, but she never spoke of her father, not once. When asked about her childhood, she would only say, "There was a room I was never allowed to enter, and I never asked why." The palace still stands. Tourists walk its corridors. They marvel at the chandeliers, the marble, the gold. But some corners remain roped off. Some doors don't open. Some wings are always under renovation. And if you stand quietly enough, long after the tour has ended, they say you can still hear it, the flicker of candlelight. A woman's voice, not screaming, just humming. A song no one knows, a song no one dares name. Because some kings are remembered for their crowns, but others are remembered by the silence they leave behind. History tells us about crowns. It shows us portraits of kings, proud, victorious, divine, but behind those golden frames are stories painted in shadows. Ferdinand VII ruled with velvet and silence. He built a kingdom not of laws, but of roles, not of justice, but of theatre. A stage where love was rewritten and suffering was rehearsed again and again. His name remains, but the women, the ones who whispered behind curtains, who forgot their real names to survive, they are the ones history tried to bury. And yet, they are still here, in the dust on a shuttered door, in a ring without a stone, in a melody no one remembers learning, but hums anyway. Because the ghosts of kings don't haunt us, it's the silences they created that never truly leave. If this story moved you, if you believe history hides more in its shadows than its light, then stay with us. We tell the stories that refuse to be erased. Subscribe. Watch what history was afraid to say. And remember, some thrones fall in battle, others fade behind velvet.